Our discussion today will be on the topic of we know what works. And I have some good news and some bad news about that. The good news is that there has been some developments that have brought about the fact that we have come to a place where we know what works. And before we get into that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Themba Mahlega. I'm a senior program officer with the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, and I'll be your moderator for today. And so those developments I was telling you about include the fact that here at the Peace Palace in 2019, we had the Hague Declaration for access to justice, which called for justice, for governments to deliver fair outcomes and respond to people's justice needs. More recently, in 2023, we had the OECD Recommendation on access to justice and people-centered justice systems. And this aims to support the advancement of access to justice and putting in place core elements of people-centered justice. These developments show a shift, a global shift from diagnosing the problem to defining concrete, workable interventions on how to promote and implement people-centered justice. So that is the good news, or part of the good news about knowing what works. The bad news is that that is not the destination and is really a part of the journey and an early part of the journey, because now we need to ask ourselves critical questions which include how do we move from isolated innovations to system-wide change? How do we scale what works? And how do we invest in what works sustainably? These are some tough questions and complicated questions, but fortunately for us today, we have an excellent panel of speakers that will help us address these and think about this and share some insights on how we can build on what works. And so it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panel of speakers. We have Mr. Afam Osigwe. He's the 32nd president of the Nigerian Bar Association. He's a seasoned lawyer with 25 years of experience in litigation and arbitration and holds 2 LLM degrees and is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Afam serves on the National Judicial Council and Council of Legal Education in Nigeria. He's a public affairs expert and a prolific writer. On my right, next to me, we have Allyson Maynard Gibson, a known advocate of the rights for women and children, a former Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs of the Bahamas. Of the living former Attorneys General, she's the longest serving. She is the first Minister of Financial Services and the first female to take silk in the Bahamas. She's the first woman from the Caribbean to serve on the Advisory Council of the Club de Madrid, the first Bahamian to be elected as overseas bencher of the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple, and the first female chair of the Board of Trustees of the University of the Bahamas. She's active in the pursuit of people-centered justice. Next to Afam is Tatyana Teplova, who has more than 20 years of professional experience in governance, rule of law, justice, integrity, gender equality and inclusiveness, sustainability, and public sector. She joined the OECD and is currently the head of the division and senior counselor in the Public Governance Directorate. She established and leads the OECD work program on justice, rule of law, gender mainstreaming, equality in public life by developing international standards and leading cutting-edge thinking and research, advising governments and supporting country-specific reforms by leading flagship and complex multi-year and multi-country projects. And last but not least, we have on the furthest from me, Zainab Malik, a senior policy and advocacy advisor at Hill. She manages Hill's global advocacy on advancing people-centered justice. Zainab has a passion for justice, innovation, and better justice systems based on the needs of people and their challenges. She has worked as a human rights lawyer and campaigner, leading interventions on the abolition of the death penalty, police torture, and sexual and gender violence in Asia and the Middle East. And so our discussion for today, we know what works. And I'll start with a little bit of an anecdote. Last night, I had dinner with some friends and we were speaking about this session. And one of the guests at dinner said, you know, the session is called We Know What Works. And as she was explaining this, someone at the dinner table who sat in the audience, but I won't mention any names, immediately interrupted and said, do we? But do we really know what works? And, you know, that kind of, you know, took people off guard a little bit, but I felt it was a really good point of departure when we're having this conversation. Do we really know what works? And so that's the question for you, Zainab, as we start this panel, to say, do we know what works, and how do we know what works?
Thank you so much, Themba, and wow, what a question to throw at me. I mean, I would like to start off by saying I'm so honored to be on a panel with such esteemed justice leaders who I've been following all throughout my career. I mean, we sent in the men to define the justice problem for us, but when it comes down to actually solving it, I'm so honored to be joined by the two incredible women and obviously Mr. Osigwe as well. Thank you so much. So, I mean, to answer your question, I'm going to take a long-winded route and say, to really understand what works, I think we, as a community and people sitting here, first really need to be honest with ourselves about what hasn't worked. So for too long, I mean, the focus of justice has always been on making rules, and that's what we associated with. Making rules, making laws, and ensuring that those laws are followed. Which means that reform, justice sector reform, has always been driven by legal texts, political debates, and courtroom processes. Justice sector budgets and spending have also followed suit. Majority of the money in the justice sector is spent on building buildings, investing in large-scale institutions, and focusing on enforcement. And all of these, more often than not, have been far removed from the people that they are meant to serve. So it's really no wonder that for most people, justice feels very distant. It feels bureaucratic, it feels complicated, and it feels like a domain that's entirely reserved for lawyers and politicians, having no relevance to their daily lives. And I think we can all be honest about that. However, as we've heard today, the experience of injustice is something that's so deeply personal to each and every one of us. We feel it in fear when we are given an eviction notice to leave a house with no assurance of housing. We feel it in a form of betrayal when we are terminated from employment without due notice. And we feel it as a small business owner, frustrated by the lack of opportunity because we got caught in bureaucratic red tape. Now, I mean, I began my career as a lawyer who believed in all of the ideals of justice. So I began my career as a lawyer in the trial courts of Punjab in Pakistan, which is one of the busiest bars in Asia. And for over 8 years, I represented victims of crime. Sexual and gender-based violence. I represented people in property disputes, domestic abuses. And from all of my clients, even those who won in court were often left significantly worse off than when the actual crimes occurred. They were left traumatized, disillusioned, and broken by the process that they had. And I can confidently say that most of them would never choose to return if they suffered an additional crime or violence. And this is not unique to one country. It's not unique to one court. It's not unique to a specific context. I mean, Hill's Justice Needs and Satisfaction surveys across 20 countries confirm that only 40% of the justice problems that people face all over the world are resolved fairly and in a way that satisfies the people who have experienced them. Now, the consequences of this have been far beyond the justice sector. Now, 2024 has become known as the year of elections. Now, we all know that over 64 countries went to the polls, and majority of the voters voted on the side of frustration. I mean, the surveys have shown us that respect for democratic values and belief in them has not dipped significantly. What's instead changed is slowly over the years, people's trust in institutions, courts, public services has gone down. And OECD surveys, in fact, showed that last year, for the first time, there was a greater percentage of people with little to no trust in government than those who actually, in fact, trusted the government. Now, when voters turned to the polls, they voted for those who promised them fast, affordable, and effective solutions to problems that impact their daily lives. we all want a safe house, decent work, protection for our family, our communities, and a fair chance to start a small business and earn a livelihood. Now, a justice system that works, now that we're starting to deal with this question, has to be one that delivers on those promises for people and their daily lives. Now, I'm coming to the good news. We're closer than ever to understanding what works. So to your question, Tema, do we know what works? I mean, I would say cautiously that we are in a much better place today than we have ever been to finally figuring it out. And this comes in the form of us finally having a roadmap to deliver a justice system that's built around the needs of real people. And it started, as you rightfully said, in 2019 with the Hague Declaration on Access to Justice. People have been taking that vision of people-centered justice and trying and testing it in diverse contexts, to the point that we find ourselves today looking at the 2023 OECD Recommendation on Access to Justice and People-Centered Justice Systems that lays out a very practical roadmap for countries to implement people-centered justice systems in their countries. Now, very briefly, what does that look like? First and foremost, it has to start with data. More data, better data, and data that focuses on people's needs. Now, I already mentioned Hill's Justice Needs and Satisfaction surveys that have taken place across 20 countries. We've also heard from WJP today. This data is helping governments prioritize problems that matter the most, set measurable goals, and track progress. And we see in Uganda where data from such surveys has informed their alternative justice systems policy. Next, once we have the data, we must design services that work and, most importantly, focus on scaling them. Across the world, we are seeing examples of promising models that are making significant impact. We see the houses of justice in Colombia. We see the Abunzi courts in Rwanda. We see examples like LegalZoom in the US, and many other examples that we will be hearing from today as well. Now, community justice services have been mentioned before. It's a promising example mostly because it's being used by majority of people facing justice problems in many different contexts. They're simpler, they're more local, and they're more affordable. But they need to be linked with the formal justice system so that they can be scaled systematically, and that there are minimum standards ensuring that they continue to deliver outcomes for the people that they're meant to serve. Now, in Ethiopia's Oromia region offers a promising example. Community courts are handling up to 300,000 cases annually with an 80% resolution rate. And when asked, most people would rate the outcomes that are coming from these community courts much more favorably than those coming from the formal courts. And what's really impressive is that these courts are financially sustainable, and they're supported entirely by contributions that are made by the community itself. Now, Hill is now working with the federal government to develop a legal framework to support the scaling of this model across the country. And just last month, Imo State in Nigeria has launched its first community justice center, a one-stop shop that offers fast, affordable, and community justice services to the very people it's meant to serve. So change is coming, but we must focus on scaling. And lastly, we need committed leadership, such as the one joining me here today, that is committed at all levels of government, and we need meaningful investment. So now the 2023 OECD recommendation calls it establishing a culture of people-centered justice at all levels of the government, which means that it's more than just rules, it's more than just strategies, it's really about a leadership that's extremely committed to people-centered justice. As we know, visions and strategy documents are not enough. Innovation is the new buzzword. As somebody who's been working on justice innovation for a while, I hear it from across different governments. But how many ministries of justice and how many government departments have real R&D budgets? Where do smart, locally grown solutions go when they want to scale? And when an innovation has promised to bear fruit, how do we integrate it into actual justice delivery? And if the demand for justice is to win against these shrinking budgets and overstretched institutions, it cannot be business as usual. We cannot keep turning to the same old existing institutions that are overstretched, already delivering at capacity. We have to open up the marketplace for justice to new players providing legal services, like community justice workers, like the private sector. We need to be open to new partnerships and to new forms of financing. So I want to end here on a hopeful note. So for the first time ever, in response to your question, we have the data. We have the tools, we have great examples of what's already working, and we have a shared vision on how to implement it across justice systems. So to truly understand what works, we need smarter investments, we need a focus on scaling, and we need brave and courageous leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. That was a well-articulated answer to the question. And as you said, a positive and encouraging note that we know what works. What you've articulated and described is, decades of research and work that has gone into a clearer understanding of what works. One, data-driven approaches. Two, designing services that work, the promising examples that you gave us. And also three, having committed leadership. And so on that note, I want to turn to you, Allyson. Just to ask if you, concur with what Zainab says, that we do know what works. And if you do, then what are the issues? What's the challenges? Why haven't we been able to shift to a people-centered approach and scale these innovative, promising solutions that Zainab articulated? What are the barriers, and are there any opportunities?
Thank you. Let me say that I, too, am privileged to be here with such a distinguished panel and to be pursuing such an important topic. I was speaking with someone last night, and I continue to speak with Hill back to 2019 when I was on the task force for justice. And to think back then, the statistics was given that we have 5.1 billion people. That's 2/3 of the world's population who lack meaningful access to justice. That's quite a startling statistic. And it's no less real in the Caribbean. We face daily legal challenges, delays in the courts, land disputes, gender-based violence, barriers to business registration, and family law issues. And when justice fails to address these problems swiftly and fairly, the consequences ripple across our economies, our health systems, and our democracies. So justice is not just a legal issue, it's a developmental imperative. When we have strong justice systems that people relate to, it strengthens our institutions, builds social trust. And when people can resolve disputes, protect their rights, and access their services, they participate more fully in the society and the economy. I'd like to give an example of what we found worked in the Bahamas, and it was called the Swift Justice Initiative in the criminal justice sector. This initiative brought together justice actors, such as prosecutors, such as the police, the Ministry of Legal Affairs, the Ministry of National Security, appropriately the courts. We expanded our criminal courts to 10 courts sitting concurrently. We were able to reduce the presentation of voluntary bills of indictment from 344 days down to just 50 days. From 2012 to 2016, we were able to more than double the amount of matters disposed of, and the conviction rate was significantly increased for serious offenses such as murder and rape. This confidence that was built in the criminal justice system was not just a technicality. It sent a very strong signal about public safety, which is the lifeblood of our democracy. And when people trust the justice system, they're more likely to report crimes, cooperate with law enforcement, respect the rule of law, and feel protected and heard. By contrast, when justice is slow, delayed, or inaccessible, it breeds cynicism, disillusionment, and sometimes even lawlessness, such as vigilante justice. And for young people in particular, who already often feel excluded, a justice system that seems indifferent to them can even deepen alienation. So swift justice wasn't just about clearing backlogs. It was about renewing the social contract between the state and its citizens. And it sent a signal that the government took accountability seriously, that they heard the pain of victims, that it mattered, and that rights of victims and offenders would be dealt with in a fair and timely manner. In Jamaica, there exists the Justice Centers Initiative. This is operated by the Ministry of Justice. It provides free legal advice, mediation services, restorative justice programs, and child diversion services. The expansion of restorative justice is a powerful outcome of this initiative, and it gives victims and offenders a space to resolve disputes. And in 2023 in Jamaica, more than 5,000 cases were referred to this system, bringing families, neighbors, and youth together. They avoided incarceration, and they found a path to inclusion. So what are the barriers? So these things work. What are the barriers to a people-centered approach? First of all, there's fragmented leadership. Frequently, justice reform is siloed with limited coordination across sectors. Swift justice worked because it eliminated silos. There is also the situation of data deficits. We lack robust and disaggregated data on legal needs. And without this evidence, it's difficult for the public sector to bring about policies that are connected to reality. There's cultural inertia. Legal traditions have been inherited from colonial systems, and they persist, and they often prioritize procedure over impact. I'm a lawyer, and lawyers love procedure, rather than analyzing impact on the people that we serve. Resource constraints. Innovation is often underfunded, and risk-taking is discouraged by public systems. There are technology gaps. So while digital solutions hold promise, many of the regions lack the infrastructure and the skills and the legal frameworks to implement them at scale. And finally, funding. Justice imperatives are not quite as sexy and impactful as tourism or healthcare. And so funding isn't often given freely to a minister of justice. But the outlook is not bleak. Community-based systems do work, as I've already said. Digital transformation, COVID showed us that we can pivot and they can work. We have digital courts, people experience it. Regional cooperation, for example, through CARICOM and other regional organizations, provides a platform to share knowledge, harmonize standards, and build collective capacity. And then we cannot ignore civil and grassroots organizations, completely in touch with the people, and they are uniquely positioned to bring people's issues, to solve people's justice-related issues. So I want to say that as we see more and more success and we gather more and more data about success, we must invest in justice, and we can bring the rationale to invest in justice as a developmental priority and not just a legal concern. We can build cross-sector coalitions aligned with public health and empower our citizens to shape the systems that serve them. So I want to end by saying, if we position justice as a developmental imperative, I think that we can build significantly on the growth that has already been obtained.
Thank you, Allyson, for outlining these barriers and these challenges so clearly, and for also sharing, examples from the Bahamas, from Jamaica, around solutions of what works, where there's trust, where there's a healthy social contract, the implementation is much higher, and where there's fragmented leadership, data deficits, cultural inertia, resource constraints, and lack of funding, we won't be able to implement this, and we won't be able to achieve people-centered justice. This was very interesting because I saw some themes come out from Zainab and from Allyson around leadership, around the need for relying on data. And I also felt it was, brings me to yet another anecdote for you all, which is, has to do with a different conference on access to justice, the OECD Global Roundtable, actually, where we had a speaker from Kenya who was highlighting some community-based initiatives, which some of our speakers have spoken about today, paralegals and other community-based partners were implementing solutions where they were providing legal information, they were mediating disputes that were then being made orders of the court, and they were doing this efficiently and at a low cost within the communities and spaces that they lived in. It was very inspiring and seemed like a viable people-centered approach. And when this individual was asked, what are your challenges? What challenges are you facing in doing this community-based work? The first thing she highlighted was a contentious relationship with attorneys, and that they believe that they held the sole mandate for anything to do with legal services, and that these community-based paralegals did not have the space and the right or the ability to implement this. Which moves me to Afam as a question. As from the legal fraternity representing a bar association, if you have any insights on such challenges, whether they do indeed exist, or how can attorneys work more closely and with community-based legal services providers. As just an example, in the healthcare sector, it seems that those that have taken the Hippocratic Oath have a relationship with the frontline healthcare service providers that is collaborative and is helping to address the health challenges. And we wonder if in the justice sector, there's ways for this relationship to be more collaborative. And so over to you, Afam.
Thank you so very much. Thanks for the privilege of being asked to be part of this panel, distinguished panel. Let me start by noting that we try to strike a balance between the protection of legal services and then also collaborating with those whose work will in one way or the other also be of help to us and to the society. Excuse me. I live in a third world country, and some of the challenges we face may sound strange to some of us here in the room, but there are challenges that we need to surmount to be able to make progress. Some of the things I may talk about here may sound strange to you when you live, for example, in a country like Holland or Netherlands, but they are real. And so we need to work with some of these community-based organizations, because if we insist on doing them alone, we may not be able to offer the much-needed help or assistance to members of the society. So I'll talk about police and policing reforms and prison reforms, for example, and I'll start with prisons. The total number of prison inmates in Nigeria as at May 5th, 2025 is 81,200. Out of this number, 54,000 are persons who are awaiting trial, pre-trial detainees. And a large number of these have no charge pending against them in any court. They were simply remanded by magistrates or judges, and no case is filed against them in court. So you need a collaborative effort between community-based organizations, private persons, to draw attention to some of these cases and for the Bar Association to either work with them directly or give some of their members to provide pro bono services to these persons. Now, this is a blight on administration of criminal justice because there's always the annoyance that a person who has committed an offense may be detained and may serve or may be detained for much longer than he or she would have served if he or she were convicted. And it doesn't speak good of us. And that there is need to ensure that such persons who have no reason being detained have no reason to be detained. Now, the policing aspect of it is as the normal policing style in Nigeria is somebody writes a petition against you, a complaint, and there is no prior investigation. You're simply invited to defend yourself against this petition, and you're not sure that you may go home that day. And so part of the work we do with some of these community organizations is to embark on advocacy, take up cases to challenge some of these actions, draw public attention to them. As I said, some of the challenges we face may sound strange to you, but it was a very big thing. I mean, in many countries, it's inconceivable that you would be simply remanded without any charge fired against you, or that merely because somebody had laid a complaint against you, you would be invited to explain yourself without police investigating to find out whether there's any substance in such petition before asking you to come forward. And so at the Bar Association also we have what we call the Citizens' Rights Project, headed by a committee by the same name, which receives complaints from members of the society, who works with them to ensure that people get some kind of assistance. And it's worrisome that the pretrial detainees make up a large percentage of our prison population. And mind you, many of these prisons were pre-colonial or colonial era prisons, and they are all overpopulated and overcrowded. I mean, it's worrisome. And also in the area of judicial reform, I mean, there is a decline in public perception on the ability of the judiciary to do justice. People don't have much confidence in the judiciary. And when Oyi talked about the End SARS protest, that gives you an idea of the level of frustration, how police can act arbitrarily, and how the courts sometimes don't come to the aid of people. There's no timely delivery of justice. And so matters came to a head, as we would say in Nigeria, when people took to the streets. And that matter has not quite been judicially concluded because a number of persons who are believed to have lost their lives in that protest are yet to be properly accounted for or their bodies retrieved, or any public admission that they were either killed or that some of them may still be held in some unknown places. So we have a situation where the Bar Association has to embark on a lot of advocacy, oftentimes working with members of the public. And a number of individuals in Nigeria are doing the work of the courts. So if you Google Nigeria, you look for information from Nigeria, you put the name VDM, or Very Dark Man, as it's called. That's an individual who has taken to social media, take complaints from people, draw public attention to them, and they're able to solve problems. So we have a systemic problem that requires so many engagements to the reforms. The Bar Association works with so many organizations to provide solutions. But the Nigerian situation is what we sometimes call, referring to, that the more you patch, the more it leaks. So you solve one problem, and another one develops elsewhere. And sometimes it's not helped by the fact that our form of democracy is unlike the type seen in many places. So we are oftentimes led by big men who, despite we having laws that have worked elsewhere, that have led to checks and balances, that have ensured that people have constitutional forms of government, can get away with so many things because they have immunity, and when they leave office, no further effort is made to impeach them. And it so happens in Nigeria that the governors and the presidents are usually much stronger than the political parties, so the parties can rein them in. And at the Bar Association level too, if you're not careful, it is easy to blackmail you by saying that you're being funded by the opposition or that you're taking up the work of the opposition parties. So, do we know what works? Maybe. Do some of the things we know work? You may say that. But the type of challenges we face are quite different. So I don't know whether some of the things I talk about may make much sense to people in this audience. But the bottom line is that the Bar Association can't do it alone. And we cannot always insist that persons other than lawyers must solve this problem. So we have to work with them. We have to provide them support services. We have to also engage many of our members to provide pro bono services, because even though we have what we call the Legal Aid Council of Nigeria, which by law is mandated to provide free legal services, they are understaffed, they are underfunded, and they are under-incentivized, so they can't do some of these things. So sometimes we stand in the gap, or we draw attention to some of these things and do the little we can within the limited time we have, because at the end of the day, most times in Nigeria, politics trumps everything. I guess my time is almost up. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Afam, for giving us those highlights and examples from Nigeria. What came out quite clearly from what you were saying was the fact that we need to have context-based solutions to understand what works in a specific jurisdiction or environment, and that collaboration is key between the different stakeholders in the value chain. And the examples you gave from the prisons that are overpopulated and are good examples of where collaboration can take place. I just want to remind members of our audience that we would like this to be an interactive session, meaning we want to hear from you. Earlier in the day, Udo mentioned that if you do not agree, then we're welcome to those perspectives. If you think we do not know what works, we're very happy and interested to hear from you. Or if you have other examples of what works, or have some answers to the questions that we are interrogating of how can we actually start to scale what works, we're really open and interested in hearing that. But before we open, so you can start to think about it, but before we do that, we'll turn to Tatyana. We've been hearing a lot about the OECD recommendation on access to justice and people-centered justice solutions, and we'd like you to maybe unpack that for us a little bit. Could you tell us about the journey from the 2019 Hague Declaration to the OECD recommendation, as well as if you have any examples of how countries are now putting people-centered justice into practice? That would be quite helpful for us. Over to you.
Thank you, Temba. And I'd like actually to begin by saying that it really is indeed a great honor for the OECD to be part of this conversation, and for me personally as part of this panel. And I'd like to stress the vital importance and urgency and timeliness of this dialogue. So just to congratulate our partners in the Hill for gathering us here. The reason why we are here as well is not just to reaffirm our commitment to people-centered justice. It's also to see how we can and should act together. And that's why I'm also quite pleased to see that among many of our member countries and our partner countries, there is a growing recognition of the importance of people-centered justice and the importance of putting the needs of the people in the center of the justice system. We have, of course, talked already about the 2019 declaration, which was adopted here with many of the partners and institutions and countries, and this was really a turning point. It was a turning point to start looking at the justice system from a different lens, from the perspective of the citizens. And of course, since then, and actually in parallel since, I would say, 2013, the OECD started working with our members and partners to try to understand basically three things. What is the experience of the people with the justice systems? How do we know what works? So this was a question that we've been posing for quite some time. And then actually, how do we measure outcomes? Not just in terms of the caseload or the functioning of institutions, but also the outcomes for the people. So in terms of your question, what works, I feel that Zainab already covered most of the elements of the recommendation. So I'll just maybe start from a different order and a slightly different perspective. So first of all, maybe to explain a little bit what this recommendation is, because it may be a bit of a murky term, the OECD recommendation, but basically it's an amalgamation of the good practices and lessons learned that we have collected from many countries with whom we are working, of course, OECD members, but then again, it's our global partners that have contributed to this recommendation. It is a binding instrument for the OECD members, so all countries adhering to the recommendation are encouraged to implement it as much as possible, but then, of course, it's also open for adherence to all of our global partners and countries. So, and we hope that, of course, it's relevant in as many contexts as possible. It's grounded in the evidence, sometimes evidence of what works, but also quite often in evidence what doesn't work, as was already mentioned by Zainab. And we see that there are basically 5 main pillars of the recommendation. First is the high-level political commitment and leadership, but also establishing a people-centered culture in the justice sector. And one of the examples of this pillar actually comes from Canada, which established access to justice as one of the fundamental pillars of the society. And the Canadian government created an access to justice secretariat that aims to coordinate reforms across the government, but also in close collaboration with the judiciary, civil society, and other partners. And also they conduct national surveys, such as the legal problems survey, which then informs and guides the design of justice reforms. So the second pillar focuses on ensuring that services are accessible, appropriate, and also effective for different groups of population, including in rural and remote areas. And we've heard already the Colombian example here. What I'd like to mention is the mobile victims unit in Colombia that aims to reach remote groups of populations in rural areas of Colombia, and provides support in legal aid, in the registration of victims, in reconciliation services, and this way reaching thousands of people, in particular women. The next pillar is about infrastructure. So this is what we call nuts and bolts of the justice system, because of course we cannot easily move towards the outcomes if we don't have the foundations in place. And here it's also about building integrated and seamless services for the people, especially looking from the perspective of the users. Here, the Colombian example of justice houses, but then we also saw this justice houses in Mexico, in Peru, and other parts of the world. And the idea is that different services come together under one roof to provide a seamless support to the individual who is in need of justice and in need of a comprehensive care. And what is important is that these institutions are working together behind the scenes to improve coordination, improve collaboration, and actually act as one player, one service to respond to the multidimensional needs when it comes to someone who is experiencing justice problem. We know that justice problems are not coming by themselves. They are often linked to health problems, social problems, family, debt, housing. So there is indeed this multidimensionality of needs. Next is is the reminder that people themselves need to be empowered to drive justice transformations. And here, the recommendation emphasizes legal capability, meaningful engagement, and inclusive processes. And one example comes from the United Kingdom that has an initiative of street law and also designed a range of legal education curricula to help build legal empowerment and equip people, especially young people, with the knowledge and confidence to engage with the justice system, but also to resolve justice problems independently to the extent it is feasible. And the final pillar, but of course, actually, it's the last but not least, and Zainab started with this pillar as the first pillar, is the importance of robust data systems that collect and use, and this is also really, really important, that you need to be to have the systems that are able to use people-centered data to inform planning, budgeting, and reform. And another example comes from the Netherlands, where the OECD has a privilege of supporting the government in how to use people-centered data to develop a national roadmap for justice reform, which is aligned with the Justice Recommendation to shape a more inclusive and responsive justice system. So in closing, again, the recommendation aims to provide a bit of a roadmap and the know-how for governments to continue, innovate, and to try different solutions. Of course, it's a bit difficult to say that we absolutely know what works, but this was certainly our best attempt to codify and bring together the good practices that we've observed around the world, and we certainly hope that this is a starting point for continuing developing this knowledge.
Thank you very much, Tatyana. That was a great overview of the OECD recommendation, talking about political commitment and culture, which is very important. The example from Canada was a good one, and having accessible, appropriate, and effective services, infrastructure, and that host of examples from Latin American countries around the justice houses, which we're seeing more and more as impactful ways to support people's justice needs, and an empowered populace being the fourth, with examples from the United Kingdom. And finally, the D word, which is a constant theme. Data cannot be stressed enough clearly that we need to have data-driven solutions, and some good examples from the Netherlands. Yes, so over to you folks. Any questions for our great panel of speakers, or any comments that you want to share? I see there's a hand up, and the mic is on the way. And if there are any others that want to get into the queue.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Noé. I work for Cordate in the Institutional Funding Department. Cordate is a Dutch-based INGO with both a humanitarian and development portfolio or mandate. We work in most fragile and conflict-affected areas in the world, and we focus also on justice and justice system development, peace building. One of the main challenges that we face, and which I also would like to turn to the community of practice and knowledge partners here to get some answers, is how do we adapt to evolving shocks, including humanitarian shocks? And we have programs that are hampered in Eastern Kivu, for example. We also have shocks that we deal with in the Sahel, with a lot of insecurity, lack of access to certain areas, where also United Nations don't have access. So if you have best practices, examples, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? If not, it seems like that's an open question for the speakers. I don't know if there are any of you that want to take that important question on about how we respond to shocks. And are there any examples that you're aware of that can address this?
Thank you so much for the question. I guess I will answer from a slightly different perspective, that indeed what is important for the justice systems and justice services, both in the fragile context but also in the broader context, is to develop a degree of resilience and adaptability to respond to the diverse needs. The OECD is doing quite a bit of work in integrating justice responses in disaster preparedness and response, in the follow-up to the extreme weather events, and how to support people in responding to different legal and justice needs that are arising, and the importance of actually designing an integrated and people-centered approach in those services. So that's maybe something from our experience to reflect on.
May I add?
Absolutely.
Speaking from a government perspective, I think that it's really important, as you've already said, Tatyana, to work very, very closely with the policymakers and also to understand, as our president has said here, the cultural context in which you're working, and to really very much connect also with people on the ground. Because I think that when people understand what their rights are, understand how to access, understand where they can access, and especially if we look at the power of technology today, I don't think that Starlink is available everywhere. And I don't think that there are a lot of communities where young people in particular don't have access to internet and various forms of technology. It may not be affordable, but there is that access. I think it's really important there's not a cookie cutter sample, very much dependent upon the environment in which you're working. I think that I've experienced in government that sometimes NGOs, international NGOs, believe that there's a top-down, there's a cookie-cutter solution that can apply to every country, and there just isn't. There's the principle of justice, but it really has to be contextualized to be successful and to be resilient and sustainable.
Thank you, Tatyana and Allyson, for those remarks. And while I'm on it, okay, there are a few hands that have come up now. I'll ask Sam and then Alex next. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to President Osigwe, and I really recognize what you say about the challenges that you face. Let me start there. The bar associations generally, in very quick terms, are often cited as one potential example of making scaling difficult because of resistance to change and because of the fact that they have a legal services monopoly in many ways. That's not always entirely correct, but that's what's often said. I'd be very curious to hear from you what good examples you have in Nigeria that you're aware of where a bar association is actually part of developing new stuff, what kind of things they are. And also, I suppose it would be very useful for us to know, how can we support bar associations in the scaling question and dealing with these issues that you so well described in your intervention.
Thank you so very much. I try to draw the distinction between bar associations protecting the legal services industry and in collaborating with other organizations to see that things are done. So, for example, in Nigeria, we would protect the legal services industry because statutorily, it's only lawyers that can provide the business. So if a non-lawyer encroaches upon that area, it may amount to a crime. But it doesn't mean that we are not able to cross this line and work with other persons. And because my time was up, I was not able to talk about also the work being done by the Bar Association in ensuring compliance with various statutes. For example, the one that require magistrates, judges to visit detention facilities to inquire about persons who are being held there and either order their release or make an order that they be charged to court or that they be released on bail. So in this area, we work with non-lawyers. We work with judicial officers. And also in areas of working for judicial reforms or legislative reforms, it's not a strictly legal business, but it's a job that lawyers are interested in and which the Bar Association does a whole lot of work, reviewing laws, working with law reform committees, or working independently, or even tackling bills as they make their way through the legislature. So it's not every time that you adopt a protective or protectionist stance because you live in a society and you realize you can't do it alone. And in a large number of cases, you need to work with other persons to get things done. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Very interesting session. So a problem that in general when thinking about justice solutions and transformational changes that we face is the lack of coordination in many cases. So the justice system and overall many of the justice problems that we have to deal with are in charge of, different institutions are in charge of dealing with these problems, not only within the justice sector, but even sometimes beyond the justice sector. So can you talk about some experiences, successful experiences in dealing with coordination and really moving this work forward, and examples in which this effort not only happens at once, but really continues over time? Thanks.
I'd like to give an example of the family court that has just commenced in the Bahamas, but exists in other Caribbean jurisdictions. So you talk about cross-sectoral cooperation. Of course, in the family court, there are divorces and those kinds of traditional family matters, child protection, matters of financial provision, and so forth. In our family court, the physical environment is such that the lower courts and the higher court sit in the same complex. So it already gives the impression of streamlining a process. The court sits differently. So rather than sitting in an adversarial manner, it sits in an inquisitorial manner, inquiring into the matter, sitting at a round table. Many of our families are headed by single mothers who work, and so the court sits in flexi hours so that the mother can come and spend time, and can come after work. The children, so there's in the court, childcare, yet another area, is provided at the court complex. Appropriate childcare, whether it's a creche for infants or for older children, homework facilities. Another area, psychological and social welfare, is provided in the same complex. The judges need to lean in on that kind of support when they are adjudicating. And also, finally, financial support services are also there. And where we are also leaning in on exploring is rather than the state being the only entity to provide these services, that the private sector can now become involved, and that can really help these rapidly scale up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to answer that question from maybe a different perspective. I think one of the means that we see now being adopted, a practice to facilitate services that sort of break these silos of different institutions, is the adoption of human-centered design processes in designing justice services. And we see that happening because if the starting point of design is the needs of people, inevitably you end up with solutions that bring different institutions together. And we see those examples with Hill's Innovation Labs that we've been conducting across the board. And community justice services are a very good example of breaking across silos, because inevitably they do not adopt the adversarial method of resolving disputes. It's always it's a negotiation. We see third-party agreements. We see different kinds of institutions being roped in and different mandates. So that's really where we see all of this coming together. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Oh, yes, sure.
Sorry, just really briefly, I think these were fantastic examples. Maybe from the OECD perspective, what we observe is that there is a need for the collaboration at the national level, so be that between the different branches of the state, then also with society, local level, and there are specific service initiatives that coordinate service provision, but then also across the justice chain effectively. So if we are talking about national coordination, I think examples from Indonesia and Colombia are actually excellent as they involved the ministries of planning, and they work, which work with with all of the departments, including the Justice Department, in actually designing national strategies and making sure that different parts of the puzzle fit together, including for justice. Local level, we've talked about justice houses, but also there are legal medical partnerships from the United States. Also in Portugal, an interesting model where you have local governments hosting justices of peace. So that's also an interesting collaboration between the judiciary and the local government. And then, of course, when we talk about the coordination across the justice chain, again in Portugal, it's interesting that they are connecting the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and the judiciary, and many of the models actually of the online dispute resolution that enable for a citizen, going back to Zainab's point, it's so citizen-centered design, human-centric design, that basically you can navigate through your journey in a seamless and integrated manner. So I think that those are interesting examples of how coordination can work through different lenses.
Thank you, Tatyana, for those concrete examples, which I think are quite helpful. We have come to the end of our session. I could have gone on listening to these amazing examples and this inspiring work that you're all doing, but we are bound by time, and I will not be able to do justice in summarizing all that you have said, but I will try to just mention 3 things that I thought really rose up for me. And the first is that we do know what works. I think we have definitely answered that initial question. You have shared a broad range of evidence of, from various jurisdictions, of which confirms that when justice is accessible and preventative and people-focused, it improves the livelihoods and well-being and trust in institutions. The second thing that I think is a key takeaway from this session today is that because we know it works, the challenge is not invention, but rather the implementation. That is where our work lies in terms of how do we scale these innovative solutions, how do we make them relevant to the different contexts that they need to be applied in, taking the broad principles and applying them. How do we streamline regulations? So we need to move to the implementation part of things. And finally is that this scaling requires shared leadership. Leadership is something that was spoken about quite clearly, and it's leadership across the board, from the bars associations to governments to civil society and international stakeholders and communities. Everybody has a role to play in working together to achieve access to justice. So those are just some of the key takeaways I thought I'd highlight in closing. Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to join me in, to give a round of applause to this excellent panel of speakers. Thank you so much.